The title is the topic. Today I'm going to review the feminist frequency video The Scythian, Positive Female Characters in Video Games.
The hero of the 2011 pixelated adventure game Sword and Sorcery is a brave adventurer known only as the Scythian, and the game tells a story of her quest to collect the 3 pieces of the Golden Trigon. Now, if a quest to collect pieces of a magical triangular artifact sounds familiar, that's no accident. Sword and Sorcery's Trigon is a clear reference to the Triforce of the Legend of Zelda games.
I'm not 100% sure if that reference is supposed to be from Zelda, although I could see that as a possibility. What I do see happening though is Anita is already trying to compare this to the Legend of Zelda games.
And Link's recurring quest to collect pieces of the Triforce is perhaps the most famous heroic quest in the history of fantasy adventure games.
Now she just brought Link into the discussion, and talked about how his quest is one of the most famous in video game history.
By drawing on familiar gaming icons and conventions that many of us already associate with legendary quests and timeless adventures, Sword and Sorcery quietly asserts that women can fill the role of mythic hero as effectively as men can.
That is true, but it has been established since long before the invention of this game that females can fulfill typically male roles. For example, Ms. Pac-Man fulfilled the role of Pac-Man. Games such as Metroid, where you go on an adventure, shoot guns, collect power-ups, and defeat the bad guy, was fulfilled by a female. There's also any number of action-adventure games and RPGs where a female character was chosen for the role instead of a male. There isn't really anything groundbreaking here. I could understand if this was a first-time thing or a rare event, but it isn't.
With the aid of a gorgeous and mesmerizing soundtrack, Sword and Sorcery's retro-inspired visuals paint a pleasantly abstract landscape players can navigate through the simple act of tapping or clicking.
Which is where I'll start to highlight the differences between this and the Zelda games. This is what Anita said about the Zelda franchise.
Sword and Sorcery's Trigon is a clear reference to the Triforce of the Legend of Zelda games. And Link's recurring quest to collect pieces of the Triforce is perhaps the most famous heroic quest in the history of fantasy adventure games.
If she wants to start comparing this game to Zelda, we should be fair and point out all the differences and not just the ones she highlights.
With the aid of a gorgeous and mesmerizing soundtrack,
Zelda also had good music. I have no issue with this game if it also has a great soundtrack. Good music makes for enjoyable gaming.
Sword and Sorcery's retro-inspired visuals paint a pleasantly abstract landscape players can navigate through the simple act of tapping or clicking.
In the Zelda games, you had free reign with Link to go wherever you want and do what you want, at least within the confines of areas that were already unlocked. Zelda's game engine is more diverse than this game if it is just about tapping and clicking to go somewhere.
Paint a pleasantly abstract landscape players can navigate through the simple act of tapping or clicking.
I'm not trying to belittle this game as it could be fun to play, but at this point, given the gameplay mechanics, no matter how well written it is or what's in store, I would most likely choose a Zelda game over this if I had to pick one.
And the game tells a traditional yet emotionally resonant story, proving that you don't need technically impressive graphics to create a world worth exploring and a tale worth telling.
Games like Minecraft demonstrated you don't need impressive graphics to have a game worth playing, and several games that predate the modern era of video games proved good storytelling is not limited to the graphics, but more so to do with the writing. Even at that, a world worth exploring and a good story are only part of the game. Another aspect is the gameplay itself. Based on the gameplay, even if this had a superior world to explore and better story than Zelda, I'd probably still play Zelda if I had to choose.
In fact, the level of detail is so low in our pixelated protagonist, and our tendency to assume that heroes are male by default is so widely reinforced, that some players have made the mistake of assuming the Scythian is male, at least initially.
Going back to one of your previous videos, Ms. Male Character, you explained why they added gender signifiers to low pixelated games.
With only a few pixels to work with, designers built on top of the original Pac-Man template, adding a red bow, red lipstick, an eye with makeup, long lashes, and a mole as beauty mark.
When they get away from these gender signifiers in low pixelated games, people assume it is a male.
Studied extensively.
I'd also argue that gender signifiers are more important in low pixelated games to identify a male from a female. If you look at society, women mark themselves more than men with makeup and earrings, so for that to appear in a game isn't necessarily a bad thing if it is due to this reason.
Because it's a reflection of our society.
Since these gender signifiers reflect society, I don't see it as an issue with low pixelated games. In more graphically complex games, where gender is easier to identify without gender signifiers, it does eliminate the need for them. I'll also note that the gender signifiers tend to be more prevalent with the cartoony or silly games. So it's not surprising, since Swords and Sorcery comes across as a little more mature than some of those other games, that they would actually exclude these gender signifiers that are not typical with more adult and mature games. So my argument would be, why not allow, at least for low pixelated games, a gender signifier for women?
Thankfully, the game doesn't resort to clear gendered signifiers like a pink outfit or a pretty bow in her hair, nor does it present her gender as some kind of surprise twist like we see in the original Metroid.
But you just said there was an issue with identifying the character at face value.
In fact, the level of detail is so low in our pixelated protagonist, and our tendency to assume that heroes are male by default is so widely reinforced, that some players have made the mistake of assuming the Scythian is male, at least initially.
So couldn't I make the argument you do the character a disservice by not allowing the player to know it is a female right off the bat? As far as the surprise twist goes,
Nor does it present her gender as some kind of surprise twist like we see in the original Metroid.
in Metroid you probably weren't supposed to know till the end of the game. You already established in this game it isn't meant to be a surprise twist, so why confuse the player by not identifying the character as female from the beginning?
In both visual design and writing, Sword and Sorcery is subtle about asserting the Scythian's gender. Though once you acquire the Megatome at the end of the game's first episode, you're presented with the thoughts of other characters who refer to the Scythian using female pronouns.
It's subtle till you get to the end of the first episode where they refer to the Scythian as female with pronouns. Without dialogue that refers to gender, it's that much more difficult to tell she is female. In an attempt to explain how this is a great achievement in gaming, that they didn't defer to standard gender signifiers in a low pixelated game, you are actually reinforcing how confusing it can get.
Studied extensively.
I'm not saying I disagree with your premise that women are marked in games. You are just reinforcing why they decided to add these marks to female characters to begin with.
It's not just in the visual sense that the Scythian lacks clear definition. We know very little about her history and nothing about why she's undertaken the quest to defeat an ancient evil. While games often give us images of heroes who are fated to defeat evil forces, it's rare for these heroes of myth to be women. Like many video game heroes, the Scythian is essentially a silent protagonist, a figure defined primarily by her actions, which makes her a blank slate for all players to project themselves onto.
Why should it matter if it's a blank slate? The game, as you said, already has a story.
And the game tells a story of her quest to collect the 3 pieces of the Golden Trigon.
And you clarified that it has an emotional story and a tale worth telling.
And the game tells a traditional yet emotionally resonant story, proving that you don't need technically impressive graphics to create a world worth exploring and a tale worth telling.
If it's a blank slate and it has these storytelling elements, you can't project yourself onto the character. Once the story progresses, it will become about the character story.
But while we don't actually hear her speak to other characters, a bit of the Scythian's personality does come through as her thoughts serve as a kind of narration for the story.
If the character takes on a personality of their own, you won't really become the character entirely. You can have memorable moments from the game, but games don't generally have a long-term real-world impact that can be demonstrated through science.
Her quest is referred to as a woeful errand from very early on, an important bit of foreshadowing that communicates that her task is not a happy one. But the grim nature of her errand doesn't overshadow the Scythian's spirit or the tone of the game itself. The character's quirky, often humorous thoughts, along with the sense of wonder in the world, makes this journey magical, delightful, and melancholy all at once.
It does sound like an interesting game. I give you props for being more positive in this video as opposed to the negativity of previous videos.
Sword and Sorcery is broken up into a series of short sessions, most of which focus on the Scythian acquiring pieces of the Trigon. There are some simple, timing-based combat encounters, but the majority of time is spent exploring the world and solving simple puzzles that require players to pay attention to environmental details like trees, birds, and reflections in the surface of a pond.
Which is where I get back to the Zelda comparison. With Zelda, you get more than some combat encounters. The entire game is going around and cutting things up with your sword and killing them with various weapons, but you also get puzzle-solving elements as well. It sounds to me like this game is more about solving puzzles with some combat, and Zelda is more about combat with some puzzle solving.
The game is primarily concerned not with combat and killing, but with the natural beauty of the world the Scythian is trying to protect.
I have to say this again. If I had to choose one, I'd still choose Zelda, as I enjoy combat-style games more than puzzle games. I do like puzzles and don't mind solving them, and there is nothing wrong with primarily puzzle-solving games. But if you're trying to compare this to Zelda in an attempt to convince me I would enjoy this more, you probably won't. Even though this focuses more on the beauty of the world the Scythian is trying to protect, without the combat elements so prevalent in other games, I'd probably get bored. I mean, I could play some games like this, but I'd never give up all the games I like to play only these kinds of games.
Using the mysterious power of the Song of Sorcery, players sometimes manipulate the environment in some really surprising ways, creating the feeling that this is a magical world where just about anything can happen.
Kind of like the Zelda games. I can definitely see similar elements, and there's nothing wrong with that.
Okay, at this point, if you haven't finished the game yet, you should just go do that right now. Even if getting to the end involves a whole real-time moon cycle mechanic that might take you a couple of months to complete. Unless, of course, you reset the clock on your gaming device, or if you're able to find the special moon grotto location. But spoiler alert, we're about to talk about how the story ends, so you've been warned.
What I liked about that section was you gave a spoiler alert and some tips for this game. We've learned quite a bit about the game, but I don't feel anything important was spoiled just yet, so I give Anita props for that.
Most video game heroes become more powerful as their quest progresses. This is one way in which Sword and Sorcery subverts expected gaming tropes. There's nothing in it for the Scythian. She doesn't gain more health or better gear over the course of the game. In fact, the quest takes a toll on her. She starts the game with 5 units of health, but loses 1 each time she wins a boss fight, decreasing her overall maximum health as her adventure progresses.
Let's break that section down.
Most video game heroes become more powerful as their quest progresses.
That is because becoming more powerful is funner than becoming weaker. We have to remember that what drives the market is games that are fun to play.
This is one way in which Sword and Sorcery subverts expected gaming tropes.
There's nothing wrong with expected gaming tropes if they're a proven formula that works. There's also nothing wrong with trying different things or subverting tropes, but most successful games come down to formulas that work. Some of these developers have been making games for years and are very good at what they do. It wasn't till things like tropes versus women in video games came on the scene that people started trying to inform developers that these tropes should no longer be used. This video isn't nearly as bad as your previous videos, but there's still that element of trying to convince us subverting what is proven to work is somehow going to improve the industry. If you weren't comparing this to the Legend of Zelda franchise, I probably wouldn't mind as much, but if you're going to compare this to a game series that set a standard for that style of video game creation, you're trying to bite off more than you can chew.
Studied extensively. There's nothing in it for the Scythian. She doesn't gain more health or better gear over the course of the game.
When I played The Legend of Zelda or Ocarina of Time, I fell in love with the big Goron sword the first time I got it. I played it through several times after that, and every time after I became Adult Link, I would complete the quest for that sword as fast as I could so I could use it for the rest of the game. There's nothing wrong with games where you don't get more health or better gear, but you did compare this to Zelda earlier. If you weren't comparing this to Zelda, I wouldn't make the counter comparisons. For a lot of people, based on what you've said so far, Zelda would still be the better game for people who prefer combat-focused games. That doesn't make Sword and Sorcery a bad game, it just makes them different.
In fact, the quest takes a toll on her. She starts the game with 5 units of health, but loses 1 each time she wins a boss fight, decreasing her overall maximum health as her adventure progresses.
Nothing wrong with making a game more difficult as you go, but this makes it sound more boring the way you framed it. Saying it takes a toll on her and she gets weaker makes it sound less fun than a Zelda game where you gain more health and get stronger. It's always gratifying to get a heart container at the end of each boss fight in Zelda as a reward. Getting weaker after a boss fight isn't as fun as getting rewarded for a job well done.
This game is not about leveling up or becoming more powerful.
Leveling up in games and getting stronger is rewarding. That is probably why those games are so enjoyable. Also, in Zelda, you get tools like the hookshot and boomerang that serve more functions than just to make you stronger. They help you to do things you couldn't normally do without them. If you are comparing the two, you keep reinforcing why I like Zelda games more than this. Not saying this is a bad game, just explaining why I prefer Zelda to this.
And Sword and Sorcery ends with the Scythian doing something Link never has. To rid the world of an ancient evil, the brave hero sacrifices herself.
Something Link has never done. I'm not going to research every Zelda game to confirm that, but I do know Link survives the final battle in most of the games I've played. Some people don't care as much about the storytelling elements as they do the gameplay. There's nothing wrong with a good story, and a bad story would imply bad or lazy writing.
Studied extensively.
You've spent a great deal of this video trying to convince us how fantastic this game is, not just based on the writing, but by the fact it gets away from game design elements that have stood the test of time. There's this push from your direction to get rid of certain tropes and storytelling elements, and this game was picked in large part to further that narrative. I'm not attacking this game, I'm attacking the ideology you are pushing by choosing this game for the reasons I laid out. And you compare the Scythian to Link by the way the character sacrifices herself.
And Sword and Sorcery ends with the Scythian doing something Link never has.
That doesn't make this character any better than Link, it just makes her different. It's like you spent this video comparing it to the Legend of Zelda games to imply you can make games that are better than Zelda by changing gameplay elements, character design, or plot devices. It doesn't make it better, it makes it different. But for me, even if you could prove the Scythian to be better than Link based solely on character design and storytelling elements, I'd still choose Link. Not because Link is a guy, but because Zelda sounds funner to me. I'd probably also choose Samus from Metroid or Bayonetta over Sword and Sorcery if I had to choose one.
Unlike the deaths of so many female characters in games which serve the purpose of fueling the development of male characters, the Scythian's death is tragic because her life had intrinsic value. We projected ourselves onto her and experienced the world through her.
We aren't talking about side characters. This is the lead protagonist. Anytime the lead protagonist sacrifices themselves, male or female, it generally won't be to further the story of any other character. I could probably find games with lead female protagonists where a male character dies to further the story. It probably does happen more to women, but I'm sure it happens to men in media as well when the female is the lead character.
In the game's final moments, we see the people of the region pay their respects to the Scythian, and we mourn her death along with them. She didn't just exist in relation to another character. She wasn't just somebody's wife or sister or daughter, but rather she existed as an individual and as a hero.
I don't think playing this game would change me that much in my personal life if that is what you are trying to get at with projecting ourselves onto a blank slate. Even though we experience the world through her, I doubt projecting ourselves onto her has any real-world impact. It's not like this game is going to drastically change people in the real world due to the nature of the design. And due to the fact you said she was her own character, that stands regardless of who plays the game. At the end of the day, the Scythian is who she is. You are who you are, and I am who I am.
The game's ending suggests that the Scythian will not be forgotten by the other characters, and the visuals and music work together to elicit a complex assortment of emotions, a sense of celebration of the Scythian's courage, and a sense of grief at her death.
Will not be forgotten by the characters, but at the end of the day, these are characters in a video game. You make them sound as if they're someone important in the grand scheme of things, when in reality, they're just pixels on a screen. I can see having an emotional response to a game if the music and story is good, but I don't think there are any long-term effects from these games in the real world.
While the necessity of the Scythian sacrifice is worked into Sword and Sorcery's story from the beginning, and lends this particular game an emotional weight its quest might otherwise lack, we certainly don't want all female heroes to be tragic ones.
I could agree with that.
But we do need more women-centric stories of all kinds.
I don't have an issue with more female protagonists, I have an issue with the way it is being pushed by people on your side. If I'm not mistaken, there are statistics that show almost half of gamers are women, although that statistic is debatable. There is also evidence to suggest women like different games than men. Puzzle games like this, with more emotional stories, might very well appeal more to a female audience.
When archetypal fantasy heroes in games are overwhelmingly portrayed as men, it reinforces the idea that men's experiences are universal and that women's experiences are gendered. that women should be able to empathize with male characters, but that men needn't be able to identify with women's stories.
The problem is men and women are different. We have different preferences and tastes. If you force games to go the direction of what you prefer, then I'll get bored and want something different. I prefer combat games. You may prefer puzzle games. If you would stop trying to force men to accept the games you want, and would spend more time encouraging the kind of games you like instead of attacking the ones we like or the ones that were already here, maybe that would be a better option.
Sword and Sorcery gives us a female protagonist and encourages us to see her as a hero first and foremost, one who also just happens to be a woman.
So you found a game you liked, did a good job explaining why it's worth playing, yet implied the industry needs to change to make these kinds of games. Another thing you have to understand is women may prefer puzzle and storytelling games more than men, whereas men like action and combat games. I noticed that Jonathan McIntosh is now credited as a producer instead of a writer. Know what was different about this video? Anita didn't spend as much time making real-world claims that aren't backed by science. She did more to compare this to another game rather than belittle or attack that game. To me, this is a step in the right direction. Also, Anita's hair is down in this video. This is the first time she's done a pop culture video where her hair is down since McIntosh came on board. It's also her first gaming video where she ditched the plaid shirt. To me, this humanizes Anita. It's reminiscent of her older videos where she was more like herself. Not to mention the lack of negativity. There isn't much attacking anything in this video. It's more like, here's what I like, and here's what I think will improve things. I actually like a step in the direction of positivity. With all the negativity I see, we need all the positivity we can get. If you like this video, I have a playlist tackling Anita Sarkeesian and her work and encourage you to check it out. It also includes reviews of her Tropes vs. Women in Video Games series.
I get a lot of support from people who really like my videos, and they've even been used as educational tools in classrooms. Educational tools.
I leave my audience with one question.